Swann's Way, Cambrai 2, Part 8 by Marcel Proust. We used always to return from our walks in good time to pay Aunt Leonie a visit before dinner. At the beginning of the season, when the days ended early, we would still be able to see, as we turned into the Rue d'Esprit, a reflection of the setting sun on the windows of the house, and a band of crimson beyond the woods where the Calvary stood, which was mirrored further on in the pond, a fiery glow that, accompanied often by a cold that burned and stung, would associate itself in my mind with the glow of the fire, over which was roasting the chicken that was to furnish me, in place of the poetic pleasure I had found in my walk, with the sensual pleasures of good food, warmth, and rest. But in summer, when we came back to the house, the sun would not have set, and while we were upstairs paying our visit to Aunt Leonie, its rays, sinking until they touched the window, would there be caught and held between the large curtains and its loops, and split, ramified, filtered, and encrusting with tiny flakes of gold the lemon wood of the chest of drawers, illuminating obliquely the room with the same delicate slanting shadowed beams that fall among the undergrowth of forest trees. But on some days, though very rarely, the chest of drawers would long since have shed its momentary incrustations. There would no longer, as we turned into the Rue d'Esprit, be any reflection from the setting sun spread out on the window panes, and the pond beneath the Calvary would have lost its fiery glow. Sometimes it had changed already to an opal color, and a long ray of moonlight, bent and broken and broadened by every ripple on the water's surface, would be lying across it from end to end. Then, as we drew near the house, we would make out a figure standing on the doorstep, and Mamma would say to me, "Good heavens, there's Françoise looking out for us. Your aunt must be anxious. That means we're late." And without taking the time to take off our things, we would rush upstairs to my Aunt Leonie's room to reassure her, to prove to her that, contrary to what she had already begun to imagine, nothing had happened to us, but that we had gone the Guermantes way. And good Lord, when one took that walk, my aunt knew well enough that one could never be sure at what time one would come home. "There, Françoise," my aunt would say, "didn't I tell you that they must have gone the Guermantes way? Good gracious, they must be hungry, and your nice leg of lamb will be quite dried up now, after all the hours it's been waiting. What a time to come in! And so, you went the Guermantes way?" "But, Leonie, I supposed you knew," Mamma would answer. "I thought that Françoise had seen us go out by the little gate through the kitchen garden." For there were, in the environs of Cambrai, two ways that we used to take for our walks, and so diametrically opposed that we would actually leave the house by a different door, according to the way we had chosen. The way toward Méséglise-Lavigneuse, which we called also Swann's Way, because to get there one had to pass along the boundary of Monsieur Swann's estate, and the Guermantes Way. Of Méséglise-Lavigneuse, to tell the truth, I never knew anything but the way, and some strangers who used to come on Sundays to stroll in Cambrai, people whom this time neither my aunt nor any of us would know at all, and whom we would therefore assume to be people who must have come over from Méséglise. As for Guermantes, well, I was to know it well enough one day, but only much later. And during the whole of my adolescence, if Méséglise was to me something as inaccessible as the horizon, hidden from sight however far one went by the folds of a terrain that no longer bore the least resemblance to the one around Cambrai, Guermantes, on the other hand, meant no more to me than the ideal goal rather than the real, of its own way, a sort of abstract geographical term like the equator or the North Pole. And so to take the Guermantes way in order to get to Méséglise, or vice versa, would have seemed to me as nonsensical a proceeding as to turn to the east in order to reach the west. Since my father always spoke of the Méséglise way as the finest view of a plain that he knew anywhere, and of the Guermantes way as typical of river scenery. I had invested in each of them by conceiving them in this way, as two distinct entities with that cohesion, that unity that belongs only to the creations of our mind. The smallest detail of either of them seemed to me a precious thing that exhibited their particular excellence, while beside them, before we had reached the sacred soil of one or the other, the purely material roads at definite points on which they were set down as the ideal view over a plain, and the ideal river scenery, were no more worth the trouble of being seen than to a lover of dramatic art are the little streets that are adjacent to a theatre. But above all, I set between them far more distinctly than the mere distance in miles that separated one from the other, the distance that there was between the two parts of my brain in which I used to think of them. One of those distances of the mind that time serves only to lengthen, that separates things and places on them on different planes. And this distinction was rendered still more absolute because the habit we had of never going both ways on the same day, in the course of the same walk, but the Méséglise way one time and the Guermantes way another, shut them up, so to speak, far apart and unaware of each other's existence, in the sealed vessels between which there were no communication of separate afternoons. When we had decided to go the Méséglise way, we would start not too early, and even if the sky were clouded over, since the walk was not very long and did not take us too far from home, as though we were not going anywhere in particular, by the front door of my aunt's house, which opened onto the Rue du Esprit. We would be greeted by the gunsmith. We would drop our letters into the box. We would tell Theodore from Françoise, as we passed, that she had run out of oil or coffee, and we would leave the town by the road that ran along the white fence of Monsieur Swann's park. Before reaching it, we would be met on our way by the scent of his lilac trees, coming out to welcome strangers. Out of the fresh little green hearts of their foliage, the lilacs raised inquisitively over the fence of the park their plumes of white or mauve blossoms, which glowed even in the shade with the sunlight in which they had been bathed. Some of them half concealed by the little tiled house called the Archer's Lodge, in which the park keeper lived, overtopped its Gothic gable with their rosy minaret. The nymphs of spring would have seemed coarse and vulgar in comparison with these young houris, who retained in this French garden the pure and vivid coloring of Persian miniatures. Despite my desire to throw my arms about their supple forms and to draw down toward me the starry locks that crowned their fragrant heads, we would pass them by without stopping, for my parents had ceased to visit Tansonville since Swann's marriage, and so as not to appear to be looking into his park, we would, instead of taking the road that ran beside its boundary and then climb straight up to the open fields, take another way, which led in the same direction, but circuitously, and brought us out rather too far from home. One day my grandfather said to my father, "Don't you remember Swann's telling us yesterday that his wife and daughter had gone off to Reims, and that he was taking the opportunity of spending a day or two in Paris? We might go along the park, since the ladies are not home. That will make it a little shorter." We stopped for a moment by the fence. Lilac time was nearly over. Some of the trees still thrust aloft in tall purple chandeliers, their delicate balls of blossoms, but in many places among their foliage, where only a week before they had still been breaking in waves of fragrant foam, these were now withering, shriveled and darkened, a hollow froth, dry and scentless. My grandfather pointed out to my father in what respects the appearance of the place were still the same, and how far it had altered since the walk that he had taken with old Monsieur Swann on the day of his wife's death. And he seized the opportunity to tell us once again the story of that walk. In front of us, a path bordered with nasturtiums rose in the full glare of the sun toward the house. But to our right, the park stretched away into the distance on level ground, Overshadowed by the tall trees that stood close around it, an ornamental pond had been dug by Swan's parents. But even in his most artificial creations, nature is the material on which man has to work. Certain places will always retain the sovereignty of their particular empire, and will hoist their immemorial standards in the midst of a park, just as they would have done from any human interference, in a solitude that must everywhere return to engulf them, arising from the necessities of their exposed position, and superimposing itself on the work of man. And so it was that, at the foot of the path that overlooked the artificial pond, there might be seen, in its 2 tiers woven of forget-me-nots and of periwinkle flowers, the natural delicate blue crown that binds the water's luminous shadowed brow, and that the iris, sweeping its sword-shaped leaves in royal abandon, stretched over the eupatorium and the water-growing kingcups, the tattered violet and yellow fleur-de-lis of its lacustine sceptre. The absence of Mademoiselle Swann, which, by sparing me the terrible risk of seeing her appear on one of the paths and of being identified and scorned by this so privileged little girl who had Bergotte for a friend, and who used to go with him to visit cathedrals, made the exploration of Tansonville now for the first time permitted me a matter of indifference, seemed on the contrary to invest the property in my grandfather's and father's eyes with a fresh and transient charm, and like an entirely cloudless sky when one is going mountaineering, to make the day extraordinarily propitious for a walk in this direction. I would have liked to see their reckoning proved false, to see by a miracle Mademoiselle Swann appear with her father, so close to us that we would not have had time to avoid her, and would therefore be obliged to make her acquaintance. And so, when I suddenly noticed on the grass, as a sign of her possible presence, a straw basket lying forgotten by the side of a fishing line, whose cork was floating in the water, I made a great effort to keep my grandfather and father looking in another direction. Still, as Swann had told us that it would not be good for him to go away just then, as he had had some relatives staying in the house, the line might equally belong to one of these guests. Not a footstep was to be heard on any of the paths. Somewhere, in one of the tall trees, an invisible bird was striving to make the day seem shorter, was exploring with a long, continuous note the solitude that pressed it on every side. But he received at once so unanimous an answer, so powerful a repercussion of silence and immobility, that one would have said it had arrested for all time the moment that it had been trying to make pass more quickly. The sunlight fell so implacably from a fixed sky that one wanted to escape its tension, and even the slumbering water, whose repose was perpetually being disturbed by insects, while it dreamt, no doubt, of some imaginary maelstrom, intensified the uneasiness with which the sight of the floating cork had wrought in me, by appearing to draw it at full speed across the silent reaches of a mirrored sky. Now almost vertical, it seemed on the point of plunging down out of sight, and I had begun to ask myself whether, setting aside the desire and the fear that I had of making her acquaintance, it was not actually my duty to warn Mademoiselle Swann that the fish was biting. When I was obliged to run away after my father and grandfather, who were calling me, and were surprised that I had not followed them along the little path that mounts toward the open fields, into which they had already turned, I found the whole path throbbing with the fragrance of hawthorn blossoms. The hedge resembled a series of chapels whose walls were no longer visible under the mountains of flowers that were heaped on their altars, while underneath the sun cast on the ground a grid pattern of light, as though it had just traversed a stained-glass window. The scent that swept out over me from them was as unctuous, as circumscribed in its range, as though I had been standing before the altar of the Virgin, and the flowers as richly adorned, each held out with a distracted air, in its glittering bunch of stamens, delicate and radiating ribs, in the flamboyant style of architecture like those which, in the church, decorated the stair of the rood screen, or the tracery of the windows, but which bloomed in fleshy white like strawberry flowers. How simple and rustic, in comparison with these, would seem the wild roses in a few weeks' time, which would be climbing the same hillside path in the heat of the sun, dressed in the smooth silk of their blushing pink bodices that a breath of wind undoes. But it was in vain that I lingered before the hawthorns, to breathe in, to marshal before my mind, which knew not what to make of it, to lose, to rediscover their invisible and unchanging odour, to absorb myself in the rhythm that tossed their flowers here and there with the light-heartedness of youth, and at intervals as unexpected as certain musical intervals, they offered me an indefinite continuation of the same charm in an inexhaustible profusion, but without letting me delve more deeply into it, like those melodies that one can play over 100 times in succession without coming any nearer to their secret. I turned away from them for a moment, so as to be able to return to them with renewed strength. My eyes followed up the slope, which behind the hedge rose steeply to the fields. A poppy that had strayed and been lost by its fellows, or a few cornflowers that had fallen lazily behind, and decorated the ground here and there with their flowers, like the border of a tapestry, in which appear scattered hints of the rustic theme that dominates the panel itself. Infrequent still, spaced apart like the isolated houses that tell us we are approaching a village, they announce to me the vast expanse of waving wheat beneath the fleecy clouds, and the sight of a single poppy hoisting up its slender rigging and holding against the wind its scarlet ensign over the buoy of rich black earth from which it sprang. It made my heart beat as does a wayfarer's when he first sees on some low-lying ground a stranded boat that a caulker is repairing, and cries out, although he has not yet caught sight of it, "The sea!" And then I returned to my hawthorns, and stood before them as one stands before those masterpieces which one imagines one will be able better to see when one has ceased for a moment to look at them. But in vain did I shape my fingers into a frame, so as to have nothing but the hawthorns before my eyes. The sentiment they aroused in me remained obscure and vague, struggling in vain to free itself, to float across and become one with the flowers. They themselves offered no enlightenment, and I could not call on any other flowers to satisfy this mysterious longing. And then, giving me that joy we feel on seeing a work by our favorite painter that is quite different from any of those that we already know, or better still, when someone has taken us to view a painting of which we had hitherto seen no more than a penciled sketch, or when a piece of music that we have only heard played on the piano appears to us again, clothed in all the colors of an orchestra, my grandfather called me to him, and pointing to the hedge of Tansonville, said, "You are fond of hawthorns. Just look at this pink one. Isn't it pretty?" And it was indeed a hawthorn flower, but pink, and more beautiful even than the white. It too was in holiday attire, for one of those days that are only the true holidays, the holy days of religion, because they are not appointed by any capricious accident, as secular holidays are appointed on days that are not especially intended for such observances, that have nothing about them that is essentially festal, but attired even more richly than the rest. For the flowers attached to its branches, one above another, clung together so thickly as to leave no part of the tree undecorated, like the tassels wreathed about the crook of a rococo shepherdess, were every one of them in color, and consequently of a superior quality by the aesthetic standards of Combray, if one was to judge the scale of the prices at the store in the square, or at Camis's, where the most expensive cookies were those that were pink. And for my own part, I set a higher value on cream cheese when it was pink, when I had been allowed to tinge it with crushed strawberries, and these flowers had chosen precisely one of those tints of some edible thing or of some exquisite embellishment to one's costume for a great feast day, which tints, inasmuch as they make plain the reason for their superiority, are those whose beauty is more evident to the eyes of children, and for that reason must always seem to them more vivid and more natural than any other tints, even after the child understands that they offer no gratification to their appetite and have not been selected by the dressmaker. And indeed, I felt at once, as I felt before, the white blossoms, but now still more marvelling, that it was in no artificial manner, by no device of human construction, that the festal intention of these flowers was revealed, but that it was nature who had spontaneously expressed it with the simplicity of a village shopkeeper laboring at the decoration of a street altar by overloading the bush with these little rosettes of too tender a tone and a provincial pompadour. High up on the branches, like so many of these little rose trees, their pots concealed in paper lace where slender flares brightened the altar on great feast days. 1,000 small buds were swelling and opening, paler in color, but each disclosing as it burst, as at the bottom of a cup of pink, the flowers, the special, irresistible quality of the hawthorn blossom, which, wherever it budded, wherever it was about to blossom, could bud and blossom in pink flowers alone, taking its place in the hedge, but as different from it as a young girl in a party dress among a crowd of women in everyday clothes, who was staying at home. The shrub, all ready for the month of Mary, of which it seemed already to be a part, shone and smiled in its fresh pink attire, Catholic and delightful. The hedge did allow us a glimpse inside the park of an alley bordered with jasmine, pansies, and verbenas, among which some gillyflowers held open their fresh plump purses, of a pink as fragrant and as faded as old Cordovan leather, while on the gravel path a long watering pipe, painted green, coiling across the ground, sent up at the points from where its holes were over the flowers whose perfume it soaked, a vertical and prismatic fan of infinitesimal rainbow-colored drops. Suddenly I stood still, unable to move, as happens when something appears that requires not only our eyes to take it in, but involves a deeper kind of perception, and takes possession of the whole of our being. A little girl with fair reddish hair, who appeared to be returning from a walk, held a gardening spade in her hand, was looking at us, raising toward us a face powdered with pinkish freckles. Her black eyes gleamed, and as I did not know at that time, and indeed have never since learned, how to reduce to its objective elements any strong impression, since I had not, as they say, enough power of observation to isolate the sense of their color, for a long time afterward, whenever I thought of her, the memory of those bright eyes would at once present itself to me as a vivid azure, since her complexion was fair, so much so that perhaps, if her eyes had not been quite so black, which was what struck one most forcibly on first meeting her, I would not have been as I was, especially enamored of her blue eyes. I gazed at her, at first with the gaze that is not merely a messenger from the eyes, but in whose window all the senses assemble and lean out, petrified and anxious. That gaze that was eager to touch, capture, bear off in triumph the body at which it is aimed, and the soul with the body. Then so frightened was I that at any moment my grandfather and father, catching sight of the girl, might tear me away from her by making me run on in front of them, with another and unconsciously appealing look, whose object was to force her to pay attention to me, to see, to know me. She cast a glance forward and sideways, so as to take stock of my grandfather and father, and doubtless the impression she formed of them was that we were all ridiculous. For she turned away with an indifferent and contemptuous air, withdrew herself so as to spare her face the indignity of remaining within their field of vision, and while they continued to walk on without noticing her, had taken and overpassed me, she allowed her eyes to wander over the space that lay between us, in my direction without any particular expression, without appearing to have seen me, but with an intensity, a half-hidden smile that I was unable to interpret, according to the instruction I had received in the ways of good breeding, save as a mark of utter contempt. And her hands at the same time sketched in the air an indecent gesture for which, when it was addressed in public to a person whom one did not know, the little dictionary of manners that I carried in my mind supplied only one meaning, namely, a deliberate insult. "Gilberte, come along. What are you doing?" called out in a piercing tone of authority a lady in white, whom I had not seen until that moment, while, a little while beyond her, a gentleman in a linen suit, whom I did not know either, stared at me with eyes that seemed to be popping from his head. The little girl's smile abruptly faded, and seizing her spade, she made out without turning to look again in my direction, with an air of obedience inscrutable and sly.